皆様、お待たせいたしました。
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming and for participating in this conference despite your busy schedules. Let us start the International Conference Revision 2014 Global Energy Turnarounds and Japan's Path, sponsored by the Japan Renewable Energy Foundation. My name is Miyako. I will be serving as the MC for today's conference. First, I would like to call upon Thomas Kabache, Executive Board Chair, Japan Renewable Energy Foundation, for some welcoming remarks.
Good morning and welcome. I'm really happy to see so many people in the room. Japan will need a lot of people well informed about the renewable energy opportunities in order to have Japan develop policies regulating the electricity market or the electricity system in such a way that Japan can continue to flourish and develop its economy and its life of its people without expensive, environmentally damaging consequences of the use of imported, unsustainable, non-renewable sources of energy. To start today's conference, we have a video message from Masayoshi Son, who, by his donation, initiated Japan Renewable Energy Foundation. So let's have Son-san's video message on the screen, please.
SoftBank.
My name is Masayoshi Son of SoftBank. I would like to express my deep gratitude to all of you for gathering despite your busy schedules. Revision 2014. Many experts in the field of renewables have come together, and the experts and the participants here share the common passion for promoting renewables. Japan was the laggard amongst the industrialized nations in utilizing and propelling renewables. And for myself too, I had only really naive and simple ideas about renewable energy. However, the 3/11 great earthquake in Tohoku area 3 years ago changed and transformed all that. My thinking changed. Nuclear power was said to be secure, safe, and extremely stable. Turned out to be none of these. One single accident proved the theory that nuclear is secure, safe, and stable to be just a myth. I cringed every time I saw the scenes of the Fukushima disaster. One false step, Fukushima could have become the greatest tragedy and fiasco the world had ever seen. The mere thought sent shivers down my spine. Some people are claiming that dependence on nuclear power should be slashed to nil immediately. Others are saying that nuclear reliance should be reduced gradually, and others in various shades in between. But as far as I know, no one is proposing to reduce energy production from renewable sources. Everyone is saying renewables should be expanded. Of course, there are obstacles to be surmounted with renewables. The sun doesn't shine every day. The wind does not blow continuously. price are on the high side. However, I trust in the wisdom of those concerned. Renewable energy will, for certain, expand in our country, and I trust in the passion and of those concerned. And renewable will for certain expand in our country. In that context, an urgent topic on the Japanese agenda is reforming the grid regulation, particularly the transmission. Let me take the example of the northernmost island of Hokkaido. We ourselves are engaged in the largest mega solar and mega wind projects in Japan located in Hokkaido. However much power is generated, there is a bottleneck in the interconnector capacity to Honshu, where most of the people are, where most of the power is consumed. And universal access to the grid has not been guaranteed. Hokkaido Electric Power Company has been rejecting connections and integrations for any new renewable-based power. Thus, power can and is being produced, but Hokkaido Electric refuses to wheel that electricity, and that power cannot be forwarded to Honshu where it is really needed. Moreover, if a power produced from renewable sources are available, the consumer, the end user, may prefer to purchase such electricity. And freedom of choice is offered to residential users in many areas of the United States or Europe. And users can choose the mix of the electricity that's consumed in their households. However, here again, there is the problem that such freedom is not enjoyed by Japanese consumers. It is essential to reform the transmission and distribution system and, as a result, assure the freedom of the consumers and of the power market. I am, in principle, opposed to the idea of nuclear power generation. But unless alternatives to nuclear are submitted, we will go round in circles in an ideological debate. So today, I do ask the august experts endowed with the highest level of knowledge and wisdom relating to renewable energy to identify the concrete issues and come up with ideas, concrete ideas, to solve those problems. And for myself, when those solutions become more crystallized, I will lobby my fellow Japanese business people and the people in general, commercialize those solutions, and pioneer the way with precedents for similar thinking business leaders. And I will propel the wave of reform. SoftBank's core business is telecommunications, expanding the mobile and fixed broad network, providing interconnections to the subscribers, i.e. making people happy through the IT revolution. As this is our core business, there's a limit to what my company can do. However, the depth and strength of my thoughts and feelings are far greater than anyone else's. I would like to move forward step by step with the support of all of you here. So, thank you for coming. But unfortunately, prior overseas business engagements prevent me from attending the conference, but my thoughts are the same, and my thoughts are with you. Let me repeat my thanks to you for coming to the conference. Thank you very much.
3 years have almost passed since the Fukushima fiasco. Around the world, renewable energy has increased dramatically. The costs of renewable electricity has fallen. Much less has been seen in Japan, which is strange. I had hoped that Japan would be a world leader in developing renewable energy after the Fukushima accident, but Japan is not. In Sweden, we have approximately a third of the total energy we use from biomass alone. More than half of our total energy is now renewable, increased by about 15% units in the last few years. Denmark has about a third of its electricity from wind power. A third of the electricity from wind power, something that electric power companies in Japan claim is totally impossible. Yet the Danish Parliament has agreed almost unanimously to have a target of 50% wind power of the total electricity used in the year 2020. In Germany, generous feed-in tariffs for solar electricity is costing the German households a lot of money. But what they are now paying for is the expensive solar PV panels that were installed 5 or 10 years ago. Thanks to the efforts and generosity of the German households, the whole world can now enjoy solar PVs produced and sold at a cost that makes solar electricity competitive with buying electricity from the grid in large parts of the world. Wind power has become the cheapest new source of electricity in most places in the world, cheaper than coal, without carbon dioxide tax on coal, without any subsidies on wind. This is dramatic development, which offers enormous opportunities for the whole world to continue prosperous development of the life of poor people throughout the world without facing the immediate threats of nuclear accidents or climate change. Japan has not yet utilized these opportunities, and the reason is very simple. As Masayoshi Son pointed out, there are people who want to invest in Japan too, but they are not allowed to connect their new electricity generating plants to the grid. This inability of the Japanese legislators and government to create equal rights for new actors with renewable electricity to compete with the old coal-fired and nuclear power stations, today owned by the same companies that control the electricity grid, is the most important issue to deal with quickly. In the countries in the world where the ownership of the grid and the ownership of the old electric power producing facilities are separated, individuals and new companies have been able to invest and created the growth of renewable electricity that we see elsewhere. That is not yet the case in Japan. It is no longer necessary to subsidize renewables. It is a matter of giving renewables a fair chance to compete in the market. We will hear during this day several experiences from other parts of the world. We hope that this conference will help you to understand the real issues better than you can do if you rely on the information provided by the Japanese electric power companies, who have, of course, a strong interest in protecting their privileges. We want to create the opportunity for the Japanese people to select a policy that will make continued economic development of Japan possible without further Fukushima accidents, without becoming a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. Once again, thank you very much for coming to this event, and thanks to all the international and Japanese experts that will contribute during the day. I look forward to a very interesting day. Thank you.
ご清聴いただきありがとう。
Thank you so much for your kind attention. Mr. Masayoshi Son's message text is available outside of the hall. Please help yourselves to the text. Now, we would like to move on to the keynote speech, Nuclear Power and Power Market Reform, some lessons from the US and Europe. I would like to call upon Professor Peter A. Bradford, Professor at Vermont Law School. Professor Bradford, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for the invitation to speak to this very important gathering. As someone who at one time was responsible for the licensing of nuclear power plants and at other times for setting utility rates, the events at Fukushima were a particular type of nightmare. And it's important for me, an honor for me, to be able to share some of the more important lessons that I've learned, and I think perhaps we've learned in the US and elsewhere, about what happens when nuclear power and power market reform interact with each other. One might almost say collide with each other. I'm going to begin with my conclusions in order to avoid, or at least mitigate, my occasional bad habit of taking more than my allowed time. This way, at least you'll know the conclusions, and with luck, you'll also know the reasoning. The first point that I would like to leave you with is that nuclear power does not compete effectively in reformed power markets. In fact, its record competitively is so poor that no new nuclear reactor has ever been ordered in a competitive power market anywhere in the world. In the situations in which countries with ostensibly competitive markets have ordered new nuclear, when one looks closely, one always finds that the rules have been bent. Secondly, because of the unique nature of nuclear power in terms of how long it takes to build and how big a block of capacity it represents, the need to be assured of recovering those costs plus a profit will always compel the builders of the nuclear plants and the governments that sponsor them to foreclose or cut back on commitments to energy efficiency and renewable energy in order to make sure that while the nuclear plants are being built, the demand for their output hasn't somehow been conserved away or taken by others. Thirdly, and I would say surprisingly to those of us who have been watching U.S. power market developments over the last decade, today even some existing reactors are having difficulty competing. The industry has always said, yes, nuclear reactors are expensive to build, but they're cheap to operate, and therefore a source of profit to their owners, even in competitive power markets. But in fact, in the last year, a number of reactor closings have been announced in the U.S., and that's the case for the first time in 15 years. And finally, now there's considerable discussion in the U.S. of the extent to which ongoing changes in our utility power markets are for the first time actually threatening the structure of even the distribution utility monopolies that have come through the previous rounds of electric restructuring relatively unscathed. I mentioned the closings of some operating reactors. In fact, it's 5 plants in the last 15 months that have announced that they either will not reopen or in one case will close later this year. The U.S. has had 104 reactors, so with these 5 gone, we'll be down to 99. Of the 5, 3 were facing extensive repairs as a result of some construction misfortunes as they were looking either to extend their lives or expand their size. And the costs built into these repairs were more than they felt they could justify in power markets. But more extraordinarily, 2 of them were reactors that did not face major capital investment. They were older, smaller plants that simply were not profitable under today's power market conditions. In addition, within the last month, 2 of our larger reactor owners have announced that more closings are quite possible in the months ahead unless the U.S. revisits its power market structures and makes some changes that are favorable to continuing the operation of nuclear reactors. And of course, those changes would tend to be unfavorable to some of their competitive alternatives. In addition, the threats to the traditional utilities that are coming about from power market reforms are now broader than just the nuclear sector. The declining sales are declining faster than the utility costs decline and savings occur. In addition, in echoes of what's happened in the telephone system over the last 2 decades, more and more of the intelligence of the network is moving outward into the hands of customers. So when we talk of customer choice, it's no longer just a matter of customers being able to choose among suppliers. More and more, it's a matter of customers, especially the larger commercial and industrial customers, being able to control their usage or to control the interaction between on-site generation and purchases from utilities. So with the telephones, it was the intelligence that used to be in the switches that wound up being actually in the customer's hands in their smartphones. With the utilities, that's the intelligence that used to be in the pool operating centers and the power plants that is to some extent now winding up in the meters and in the customers' homes. Either way, it's a life-changing threat to the structure of the industry as it moves forward. And for the first time in the last year, we're finding the utilities actively resisting these changes, some of them anyway. Others are choosing to try to buy into and profit from them. And what we've historically found in the U.S. is that the utilities are not such effective competitors in the marketplace, but they are very effective competitors in the political marketplace. They have spent decades building up their skills in influencing our state and federal governments. They've never really had to compete for customers. The businesses that want to challenge them, however, are, for the most part, have grown up in a tradition of private enterprise, and their skills have to do with dealing with customers. And they're not so familiar with dealing with the governmental marketplaces. And so, at least for a time, they're in considerable danger of being outmaneuvered in politics, even as they gain in economics. Finally, with regard to these preliminary points that I've been making, let me say a little more about the extent to which the traditional utilities have a need to resist change in the context of nuclear energy. In the U.S., our national energy policymakers now speak in terms of an so-called all-of-the-above energy strategy. But this is a substitute, really, for thinking seriously about energy policy. It works in a political speech, but it doesn't really work when hard choices have to be made as to either technologies or techniques. One never does everything at once. One prioritizes. One does the most cost-effective things first. Think of it, if you will, in the context of world hunger. We're not going to fight it with everything at once. We're not going to fight it with caviar. And by the same token, given the cost problems of nuclear energy that I'll discuss shortly, we're not likely to wind up fighting climate change with a large addition of new reactors. So now let me back up a little bit and talk about the interplay between new reactors and competitive markets as we've seen it unfold in the U.S. You'll often hear it said by the nuclear industry that the U.S. stopped building new reactors in the early 1980s as a result of overreaction to the accident at 3 Mile Island. And if one looks only at the dates involved, this is a plausible statement. But the fact is, something else happened in the late 1970s, something that had nothing to do with 3 Mile Island. For one thing, nuclear plants in the U.S. had already experienced serious cost overruns and other events, not as serious as 3 Mile Island, but other events involving things going wrong. And so our Congress in 1978, before the accident at 3 Mile Island, passed a law that required utilities to buy power from anyone who could supply it more cheaply than the utilities could generate it. As you're hearing in Japan today, and as we've heard in many other countries in the face of similar measures, the utilities at first said that this was a terrible idea. There wouldn't be much power available, the lights would go out, the suppliers would be unreliable. They filed lawsuits, they delayed the implementation for a while. But by the mid-1980s, the independent power producers had proven to be capable of building large power plants more cheaply and more innovatively than the utilities. And there were a number of consequences of this, including an improvement in the operations of the utility-owned plants themselves, as they, for the first time, had to meet competition. And ultimately, in the early 1990s, electric restructuring had taken over in about half of the U.S. Now, by electric restructuring, I know you're generally familiar with the concept of unbundling. I put this sort of simplified chart up primarily for one reason, which is to stress, if I can find the pointer, that the generation sector, now controlled largely by independent power producers, separated from the ownership or the operation of transmission, ownership and operation of distribution, has become unregulated. So there is no longer price regulation, there is no longer barriers to entry when it comes to the building of power plants. But the regulated paradigm still remained for the monopoly transmission and distribution functions. Now, in the U.S., for reasons having a lot to do with the energy crisis in California in the year 2000, The process of moving toward that liberalized market structure essentially came to a halt 12 years ago, leaving the U.S. system divided between the old vertically integrated monopoly system, albeit with the obligation to buy from independent power producers, and the more market-oriented parts of this map, which are green. This one little odd blue state happens to be the one I live in, Vermont. But for the most part, the entire Northeast is a liberalized power market area, as is a good part of the Midwest and Texas. These yellow states got partway toward liberalization and then stopped following the California crisis, said, do we really want to go further? But the result is that the U.S. system is a very mixed system, and that has interesting implications for nuclear power, as we'll see in a moment. There are nuclear plants in all colors of states here, so the operating reactors are spread throughout the different models, but it's a very different story for proposed new reactors. Now, one other consequence of this story, as competition moved into the generating sector, I've mentioned that the efficiency of the existing power plants was forced to increase, a story that might well occur in Japan also. And here you can see that story graphically. The blue lines are the nuclear capacity in megawatts, shown over here. The red line is the output in megawatt hours. Sorry, this is gigawatts. So as you can see, starting at about the time power markets became meaningfully competitive, the nuclear industry succeeded in dramatically expanding the output of its reactors. Put another way, it was as though they built another 15 to 18 nuclear power plants in these years, even though in fact they built none at all. And that's the reason that nuclear power has stayed at about 20% of US electric generation, even though we have not built new reactors at all during those years. We can, I think, skip over that more elaborate slide, but to put the fact that there are no new reactors in the power market regions in somewhat different terms, you have to understand it in terms of the risk shift that power markets bring about. Under the old vertically integrated system in the US and under comparable systems in many other countries, the risk of things going wrong, the economic risk of things going wrong, rested heavily on the customers. As long as the utilities could persuade their regulators that they hadn't overtly mismanaged the plant operations, cost overruns were routinely passed through to customers. In power markets, that's not the case. You agree to sell power at a particular price. If your costs are above that price, you lose money. If you don't deliver at all, you lose money again. So the risk, many of the risks shift to the investors. And in the case of new nuclear reactors in the US and elsewhere in the world, the investors have simply refused to bear that risk. It's ironic for a technology that began in the US with proclamations that it would be extremely cheap, too cheap to meter was the cliche. How could you not make money with a technology like that? Well, it turned out that the appearance of low cost was largely brought about by the combinations of government support and assurance from regulators that the customers would bear the risk. And when power market reform shifted the risk onto the builders of the generating plants, Other types of generation, including types of renewable generation, have proven to be able to bear those risks. Sometimes they bear them with a certain amount of government support. In the US, I'm thinking of the production tax credit. New nuclear got a production tax credit too, starting in 2005. But here's the thing about production tax credits: you have to produce. And the problem with new nuclear in the US is that half of all the reactors that were ever started were canceled. And so the challenge of being able to assure that production would occur was more than the challenge that the proposed new plants could bear. The other types of risk shift that have been tried in the US include loan guarantees. So the risk shifts now not from the customers to the investors, but from the customers to the taxpayers. And in addition, during the last round of electric restructuring, we ran into an issue that seems likely to confront Japan as well. The issue that in the US was called stranded costs, namely the fact that the utilities had substantial existing investments that required prices above the prices that a market was likely to produce. So substantial in many cases that the utilities considered themselves almost certain to go bankrupt if electric restructuring went forward. And so in state after state in the United States in the 1990s, major political struggles took place. Legions of lobbyists descended on state capitals to argue over what the terms for changing the electric power markets might be. In the end, for the most part, the electric utilities received what they were looking for, an assurance that the stranded costs would not have to be paid out of competitive markets, that they would be attached to the monopoly facilities, the wires, even though in fact they arose from the generating plants. So they became a kind of a tax. And that was, in essence, the bribe that had to be paid to move the legislative process forward. One can argue endlessly about the merits of that in economic terms and in legal terms. As a practical matter, I think the restructuring story in almost every country includes a fundamental decision that the governments are going to have to make about what kind of bribes, if any, are going to be paid. And I don't mean criminal bribes. I don't mean under-the-table payments. I just mean payments to persuade the incumbents, the people who benefit from the existing system, to give up the advantages that they may well have the political wherewithal to hang on to for quite a while. In addition, with regard to new reactors, they have needed to be relieved from any obligation to go through competitive power procurements and least cost power supply planning, because it turns out that they can't survive that type of process of scrutiny. So this rather simple table just is an illustration of the transition that I've been talking about, stated entirely in terms of economic risk, because that really is a fundamental piece of this story. In the 1970s in the US system, borne by the customers, in the 80s and 90s borne by the investors. Today, for new units, new nuclear units, we see a certain amount of retreat from that liberalized model, a retreat in which the investors are once again sheltered from the risks which they have for 20 years been showing that they're not willing to bear. And so mechanisms have to be found to shift those risks back to either the taxpayers or the customers who will not have a choice about bearing them and who will not charge money for bearing them. Well, I think I've, in the course of discussing what the risks were, I've also covered the lessons. So let me move on to the peculiar story of the U.S. nuclear renaissance. That phrase was first heard about 12 years ago when it was then the Bush administration announced its intention to restart nuclear construction in the U.S. And my colleague at the Vermont Law School, Mark Cooper, has done this very useful chart, which is on the left-hand side as it faces you, a distribution of the actual costs of the plants that were built in the U.S. As part of the first round of nuclear construction. On the right-hand side, what you are seeing are the cost estimates of new nuclear plants at the time the nuclear renaissance was launched. And when you display it this way, you realize that something very peculiar was going on, because if you draw any kind of a trend line through the costs of the old plants, you find yourself up here somewhere, and yet you have a bunch of paper studies saying that the new ones will come out down here. Well, of course, this was a fiction, and as the proposed renaissance moved forward, and the utilities began to have to testify to their estimates of the actual costs and to discuss with Wall Street how much money was going to need to be raised, the cost estimates rose very rapidly. But as they rose, the feasibility of the renaissance for the first time began to come into question as well. So the Congress in 2005 passed a set of measures to try to take the sting out of the fact that power markets were just not going to finance new nuclear reactors that were going to need to charge 12 or 13 cents a kilowatt hour in markets that were selling electricity for 5, 6, 7 cents a kilowatt hour. So loan guarantees were made available, production tax credits, and a number of other forms of both political and economic support. It's worth saying that even though there was discussion during this period of the desirability of reviving a U.S. program of reprocessing and breeder reactors, the U.S. nuclear industry never had any enthusiasm for going in that direction, and the reason was fundamentally economic. Nuclear power was in enough economic trouble without adding another cent or 2 cents per kilowatt hour for the costs of reprocessing and breeder reactors. So that idea has been a non-starter everywhere except in parts of the Department of Energy, even throughout the nuclear renaissance. In addition to the support from the federal government, several states in those regions of the country where the utilities are still vertically integrated decided that they wanted to encourage new nuclear plants. And so they passed laws that put the risk back on the customers. And not only put it back on the customers, but for the first time required customers to start paying at the time the state utility regulators said that a new reactor would be necessary. So long before the plant actually came into operation, the customers were required to pay for it. And during the presidential campaign in 2008, there was still a great deal of enthusiasm for the nuclear renaissance. President Obama was generally supportive, and John McCain actually promised that in his administration there would be at least 50 new reactors by 2030. After the election, the Republican position briefly doubled, and they were promising 100. But as we'll see in a moment, reality has once again been a disappointment. Instead, what actually happened was that by the end of 2008, there were applications for 29 new reactors, the first ones in 20 years, on file at our Nuclear Regulatory Commission, with 4 more expected in 2009. But only 2 applications actually arrived. Only 4 of those 31 reactors are actually being built today. And as I said earlier, for the first time in 15 years, operating reactors were closing in the last year. Now, keep in mind that much of the justification for new reactors in the US was that we had to have this low carbon energy in order to combat climate change. Well, what's actually happened then over the last 12 years during the time that the US basically gave the nuclear industry everything that it asked for by way of federal and state support? We haven't saved a single molecule of greenhouse gas emissions by building new nuclear reactors. The ways in which we have put a dent in our carbon emissions have to do with the sources of particular interest to this community: renewable energy, also energy efficiency, some substitution of gas for coal, some expansion of existing nuclear plants, one should say. But new reactors have not contributed at all. Let's take a brief look now at the causes. We've already seen that the nuclear power plant cost estimates increased dramatically, and that was a major cause. But in addition, you can see what happened to natural gas prices during the years of 2006, 7, 8, which was Renaissance high point, up to the present, when they have dropped dramatically. As it happens, it's a coincidence because these aren't the units that this graph is stated in, but as it happens, if you look at it as at the numbers on the left as being cents per kilowatt hour, you'll see just how unsustainable is the argument that nuclear power is a good hedge in the US against the volatility of gas prices, because the only time that gas prices have ever gotten near the 12 cents a kilowatt hour that new nuclear requires at a minimum were for a couple of very brief periods of time in the last 10 years. So we'd be paying a very high insurance premium against a set of events that is actually much less costly. Now, move that story to the world price of gas, and you see a story that's somewhat different. Clearly, gas prices are much higher in Japan, and so the impact of natural gas on nuclear energy in this part of the world is not going to be the same as it's been in the US, although I think it's fair to say that in all likelihood the prices will converge in the years ahead. It's not so likely that the Japan gas price is ever likely to be nearly as low as the prices that have prevailed recently in the US. But it doesn't have to be in order to be a major threat to the economics of new reactors. This slide I like to show just because it's not Amory Lovins, it's not Greenpeace, it's not me, it's the owner of the US's largest fleet of nuclear plants, and it's their low-carbon energy options for the next 20 years. We won't go through them in detail, but this one is new nuclear, and you can see easily where it is in cost terms in relation to blocks of efficiency, renewables, gas substitution, and nuclear uprates. So Exelon is essentially saying that without new nuclear, they can meet their low-carbon goals through the workings of US power markets using a completely different mixture of renewables and efficiency. That's a really important message, more fundamental by far than any environmental opposition that that new nuclear faces, because it's this kind of a conclusion from that kind of a company that really influences the financial community too. Okay, how did this happen? We've talked about nuclear cost estimates already. The recession in 2008 and 9 took demand down, and low-cost energy efficiency has kept it low and declining since then. The natural gas prices have been low. The U.S. at one time seemed to be about to institute a system of carbon pricing, cap and trade. We didn't do it. As a result of some mishaps in our program of federal subsidies for energy sources, the concept of subsidies for new energy sources is now somewhat discredited, especially among the Republicans who tend to be the more pro-nuclear party in the U.S. government. And finally, the accident at Fukushima has, of course, shifted the political calculation somewhat too. I've been telling the story in U.S. terms so far. Let me spend just a moment on the British situation. I think in light of the time, I'll skip over the early events after the British restructuring in 1990 and just point out that the British have a fully liberalized power market that has not ordered new nuclear and was not going to, left to its own devices. In order finally to jumpstart new nuclear in Britain, the British government has just made an astonishing commitment to pay roughly twice their existing market price per kilowatt hour for 2 reactors built by France with financing from China. And that contract, that assured price, is to run for 35 years. Think of that in the context of the point that I made earlier about the extent to which new nuclear commitments must crowd out commitments to renewables and efficiency. With a commitment like that on the books, there is a major block of capacity that the British simply cannot obtain through their power markets without making the governmental decision to make this commitment to new nuclear look awfully foolish. If we go back 10 years to when the U.S. was first talking about a nuclear renaissance, can one think of a policy that might have made sense? Well, an interesting one might have been to go forward with a carbon tax or cap and trade to support a limited number of new reactors as part of a broader transition to more effective, sustained support for renewable energy and for the opening up of power markets. Those who believed in nuclear power might have bought it thinking that nuclear would emerge competitive. Those skeptical of nuclear power might have bought it thinking that nuclear power would show once and for all that it wasn't competitive. Because the nuclear mantra is this time we're going to build them on time and on budget. But on budget is not in the end going to help if it means twice the market price. And that seems to be the story that's unfolding with regard to the 4 plants that are going forward. And finally, my last lesson is that you can explain the downfall of the nuclear renaissance in the US and in Western Europe without mentioning safety or waste or proliferation. Indeed, I've more or less just done so. And yet, as Japan knows better than any other country on Earth, this energy source has those issues associated with it. They're components of the economic risk that I have been talking about, but they're also components of other types of risks as well. And so in the grand overall calculus of where new nuclear fits in the context of energy policy, it comes freighted not only with the fact that it will not be successful in liberalized power markets, but also with the fact that it has some special risks that are more or less outside of the capacity of those power markets to evaluate. Thank you very much.
ブラッドフォード教授。
Thank you very much, Professor Bradford.
今一度大き
Thank you very much. A big round of applause once again for Professor Bradford, please. Next, from Germany, we would like to hear about the latest developments from the head of Wind Energy and Hydropower Division, Federal Ministry for the Environment, Nature Conservation, Building and Nuclear. We have Dr. Stephanie Pahal with us. You have the floor.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me today to this very interesting and exciting conference. I will give you a speech about the latest developments in Germany's still ongoing so-called Energiewende, the transformation of our energy supply system. Ladies and gentlemen, I am aware that many countries, and especially Japan, look at the progress on Germany's Energiewende, the transformation of its energy system towards renewable energy sources. And I am also aware that in this regard, most countries look upon Germany in disbelief or even with distrust. In fact, the same observation can be made in Germany as well. Especially the media is very critical about the progress of the Energiewende. And you find also many experts and scientists who apparently know much better than us government officials how you best do the Energiewende and how you best cope with the challenges and problems surfacing with the transformation of our energy supply and distribution system. They see a highly industrialized country dependent on global experts, planning to phase out not only nuclear power, but also, to a large extent, also fossil fuels. Can that really work, they ask? Does it spell the end of Germany as an industrialized nation? Isn't the current debate in Germany on reforming its Renewable Energy Sources Act proof that the Energiewende has failed? And is Germany actually in the process of phasing out the Energiewende itself? Let me say right from the start, Germany is not backing out of the Energiewende project. There is absolutely no reason to do so, even if there are detractors who would love to see that happen. You should not refrain from asking what their interests might be in calling the Energiewende a failure. The upcoming revision of the Renewable Energy Sources Act, which, by the way, is part of a regular review process every 3 to 4 years in order to adjust feed-in tariffs and other regulation, this is simply intended to make the path and time frame of renewable energy expansion more predictable and thus keeping the costs for industry and consumers at an acceptable level. To give you a clearer picture, I would like to explain in more detail what we have achieved so far and the outlook for the future. This first slide shows you that the first Renewable Resources Act was adopted in the year 2000. At that time, the share of renewables and electricity production was almost non-existent. As you see, it's about 3%. Within the last 14 years, renewables, we call that's wind, PV, biomass, some hydropower, and some geothermal, were contributing to around 25% to gross electricity consumption. And our target is to extend that share to 80% by the year 2050. This target stems not only from phasing out nuclear energy, but is also linked to our goal of reducing CO2 emissions considerable for climate protection reasons. This next slide shows you some of the shares of renewable energy sources by the end of 2012. We have installed capacity of photovoltaics of up to 33 gigawatt right now. 31 gigawatt of onshore wind, 7.5 gigawatt of biomass, 5.6 gigawatt of hydropower, and some offshore wind and some geothermal power as well. And the next slide shows you that altogether these installations produced around 143 terawatt hours of electricity, which is the equivalent of 13 nuclear power stations. This next slide shows you that of the 17 nuclear power plants formerly in operation in Germany, 8 already have been taken from the grid, representing a capacity of around 9,000 megawatt. The remaining 9 nuclear power plants produce a gross electricity volume of around 97 terawatt hours at the moment. The next 2 nuclear power plants will be decommissioned in the year 2015 and 2017, and Germany's last nuclear power plant hopefully will be shut down by the end of 2022. And with respect to the Energiewende, I want to stress here very strongly that at no point has supply been compromised, or the security of supply has never been compromised. There have not been any blackouts, nor is there ground to suspect that we have a shortage in energy supply. What we see, however, is that grid operators have to focus more on grid management and short-term supply and demand forecasts in order to run the system. Over the past 14 years, the total cost of supporting renewable electricity grew up to 24 billion euros per year. And here I must point out that the Energiewende was accelerated in the wake of the accident at Fukushima. This meant that we needed to step up our renewable energy expansion, leading to a significant increase in costs. And at the present, the cost of renewable energy support for an average household of about 4 people is around 18 euros per month. And speaking of costs, which are also a major point of critique in the context of the German transformation strategy, we heard that already. I do not want to deny that now, with a share of around 25% of renewables in gross electricity consumption, it is the time to carefully review the system in order to improve cost efficiency. But I would also like to stress that the renewable support system based on feed-in tariffs so far was very successful. Not only in expanding renewables and bringing them to the point where they are now, but also in developing the industries and employment, and thus contributing substantially to domestic value creation. Especially in the wind sector, it helped creating successful export markets. And last but not least, many electricity consumers who are renewable electricity producers at the same time, like farmers, members of community power associations, some private actors and SMEs, also benefited from the revenues guaranteed by the feed-in tariff. Thus, there are not only costs, but also benefits to the economy and the people. This slide shows you some of the challenges we are facing and the next steps we are sort of starting to address. To integrate renewable electricity into the grid, we need to expand the extra high voltage network by around 10 to 15%. This will cost us in the region of about 22 billion euros over the next 20 years. Furthermore, the distribution grids need to be expanded as well, and in parts modified to support smart grid technology we also want to introduce. For example, the distribution grids need to be equipped with communication control systems. In total, costs for upgrading the grid will probably be around 42 billion euros over the next 20 years, about 2 billion euros per year. We think that this certainly is an affordable amount for such a nationwide project. This upgrade will allow up to 50% renewable share in gross electricity supply to be reliably integrated into the grid. And again, some people see that as a problem, as an economic burden. They cite, for example, extra costs and conflicts where grid extension projects are being held up during implementation. But I'm convinced that these conflicts can be solved when we discuss openly why we need this and make clear that grid extension is a necessary part of the Energiewende as well as a modern, reliable grid for the next century. And people tend to forget that a considerable part of the costs and projects would have been necessary even without the transformation of the energy system, just for maintenance and modernization reasons. And the European energy market is only possible with these grid extensions. That's another important point I want to mention here. Thus, the German Energiewende is an important element accelerating the integration of the European energy market rather than an obstacle. What we see here is a very interesting development. Critics also tend to overlook when they point out Germany as maybe a failure in expanding renewable energies. Here you can see that the price of a kilowatt hour of electricity on Germany's electricity exchange has fallen by around 40% since we shut down our nuclear plants in 2011. Electricity is currently traded on the German exchange at around 3.4 euro cents per kilowatt hour. And I would like to add another example, and Professor Bradford also touched already upon it, why not everything can be wrong with the way Germany promoted its renewables in the past. That's the British example. Just recently, Great Britain guaranteed the operators of a new nuclear power plant a price of 10.9 euro cents per kilowatt hour for the next 35 years. Our feed-in tariffs usually last for 20 years. This is not only 3 times the going rate for electricity on the German electricity exchange, it is also significantly higher than the current tariff for wind-generated power in Germany, which is less than 9% a kilowatt hour right now. So it may sound a bit absurd, but the problem with the transformation of Germany's energy system is not that it was unsuccessful. I would say it was rather too successful. The expansion targets were met far more quickly than originally expected. This can be attributed to 3 causes. First of all, and that mentioned Mr. Karberger at the very beginning of our session, it's the global overcapacity of photovoltaic systems, which we paid for, global overcapacity in wind turbines, and the ambitious expansion plans of the German federal Länder following Fukushima. But of course, I do not want to deny that there are issues and developments that need to be addressed. The rapidly and sharply rising share of renewables in the grid, however, is a contributing factor in the massive drop of wholesale electricity prices, which in turn has led to a dramatic increase in differential costs of renewables. And to clarify that, the German Renewable Sources Act guarantees plant operators a fixed tariff for each kilowatt hour fed into the grid. And the power generated is sold on the electricity exchange, and the difference between the proceeds from the sale and the fixed tariff is referred to as differential costs. And in other words, the lower the rate on the exchange, the higher the differential costs for renewables. And these are the costs that have to be covered by the electricity consumers. And yet, the electricity from conventional power plants is no longer cheaper than power from renewables. We also heard that. The rapidly growing renewables share in Germany electricity supply means that the grids also have to be expanded very quickly. This, as I already mentioned, is quite difficult to achieve as it requires long timescales for planning and approval. And here I listed all the points we want to address with the reform of our Renewable Energy Sources Act. First of all, it is because of the sharp rise in differential costs and possible planning uncertainty for the grid expansion that we want to draw up a new Renewable Sources Act established on the review of the past development and achievements. Nevertheless, we have no intention of deviating from our original goal of covering about 80% of our gross electricity consumption from renewables by the year 2050. On the other hand, we are not aiming to achieve this target much before 2050 either, as would probably be the case if we kept up the current rapid pace of expansion. May I therefore clearly reiterate at this point that the revised Renewable Energy Sources Act will not call the objectives of the Energiewende into question. It is just the next but necessary step to adjust policies to expand renewables from more than 20% share in gross electricity consumption to more than 40% in the year 2025. So what exactly do we want to change? I would like to mention just 10 points here. First, we want to give the expansion a more specific time frame. We aim to raise the renewable share to between 40 to 45% by 2025 and to 55 to 60 by 2035. We want to lay down binding expansion corridors for the different renewable sectors. For instance, we are planning new wind and photovoltaic capacities of 2,500 megawatts per year, while for offshore wind we are aiming for 6.5 gigawatt by 2020. Third, the expansion corridors are also taken as a basis for the upgrading of the grid, thus significantly increasing planning certainty for grid expansion. To keep track of old and new renewable energy installations, we will introduce a register of installations. The purpose of this is to monitor whether the expansion is proceeding in line with the corridors and to allow necessary measures for integrating new renewable installations into the energy system. Fifth, we monitor closely the price development of renewable energy installation. That means that feed-in tariffs can be reduced without jeopardizing the expansion target. Essentially, the excessive support of the past will be eliminated, and this particularly applies to wind turbines in wind-rich locations. Some of you might know that we already significantly reduced the PV feed-in tariff in the year 2012. Then the use of biomass will be significantly restricted to the use of organic waste material. There are basically two reasons for this. Due to fuel costs, the marginal costs of biomass will always be higher than those of wind power or PV. Both of them have zero marginal costs. And second, we want to prevent monocultures from arising in Germany and also ensure that land used for food crops in poorer countries is not destroyed to make room for the mass production of regenerative raw materials. At the latest, from the year 2017, we totally want to revamp the system, and by then the level of support for renewables will be determined through invitations to tender. This will identify the most cost-effective form of energy generation for the respective technologies. Another point is that we will introduce mandatory direct marketing for all new renewable energy installations. This means that installation operators must find an electricity trader to sell their power to the exchange. This will ensure that the feed-in of green electricity is geared more to demand. For instance, output from renewable installations will be reduced when prices on the exchange are low. To alleviate the burden on private end customers and SMEs, we also review privileges for industry. Companies will only be exempt from the renewable sources surcharge if their competitive situation generally justifies this. And lastly, we will also put an end to full exemption from the the renewable sources surcharge, which companies have enjoyed up to now if they use electricity they have generated themselves. This step is intended to counteract the erosion of solidarity within the system. These 10 points form the core of our new Renewable Sources Act. And these 10 points should make it very clear that we are not putting an end to the Energiewende, but continuing consistently along the same path with commitment and determination. I would like to conclude my talk by noting something that is often overlooked in discussions. Germany's Energiewende is not limited to expanding renewable energy. Here you see the other elements of our strategy. Raising energy efficiency is another key aspect, comprising the efficient use of electricity, the reduction of heat demand in buildings, and improved energy use in the transport sector. One important driver in this is our overall goal of climate protection and reducing CO2 emissions. And already regulations have been laid down, or initiatives have been launched for all these areas. Unfortunately, time will not allow me to describe these other elements of the transformation of Germany's energy system, and I will therefore conclude my presentation at this point and simply say thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
フファール様、ありがとうございました。
Stephanie, thank you very much for your presentation. So this ends the keynote and special speeches. Let us take a very short break. We will start again at 11 o'clock, the session 1, Global Renewable Energy Expansion. Thank you very much.